individually who are in this trade, I have personally witnessed the despair and distress by hard-working people. Indeed, what is one to do? On family excursions with my wife and children, I tend to blend history and leisure. Last year was no exception. We visited Mount Vernon, in particular President George Washington's Mount Vernon, his estate and his house. In one of the exhibits, at the very end, there is an unassuming little display with a most powerful, powerful lesson, a small miniature of Fort Necessity. You see, in May of 1754, then only a colonel, Washington had his first experience with military and war. It was his very first experience. Washington ambushed the French at the Ohio frontier and killed some of them. He anticipated a counter-offense and built a very poorly Fort Necessity. Needless to say that the French, with a force of 500 men and 100 Indians, did strike back. Washington sustained heavy casualties throughout the day. A torrential downpour and a weak fortified fort was all the more reason that Washington made a very sad decision late in the evening to negotiate a surrender. He gave up all of his swivel guns and acknowledged his wrongdoing in the earlier attacks. The very next day, down and trodden, conquered and defeated, Colonel Washington and the remaining men made their way back to Virginia. That day on the calendar was July 4th, 1754. Even though his first experience as a commander of soldiers was a complete and utter failure, he, Washington, did not see it that way. He later said about the event, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there was something charming in the sound," unquote. When he arrived to Virginia, he was criticized and blamed for the defeat. Ultimately, he resigned from the Virginia regiment, but with a lesson in life, and more importantly, a burning desire to never give up, and ultimately to resume later on a military career. Years later, when the continental United States was formed and an army was needed, George Washington was promoted to general and given the task to free America from the tyranny of Britain. We here today enjoy our freedoms because on July 4th, 1754, Colonel George Washington, while defeated on the battleground, never surrendered in spirit. When you celebrate next on July 4th for what happened on July 4th, 1776, do not forget the lesson of July 4th, 1754. You ask yourself, what is one to do in times like today, when it is not easy? Take out a $1 bill, look at President George Washington, think of Fort Necessity, and you have your answer. Never, ever give up. All of you are here today because you worked hard and you didn't give up. Remember it, and you will succeed. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. It is my honor to now call upon the Honorable Mark Weprin to share with us his insights and perspectives of what is currently taking place in Albany. Mark has a particular focus on representing the New York State real estate industry. Mark has a unique experience, having been appointed to and elected to various positions in New York City and state government. Mark served as Deputy Secretary of Legislative Affairs for Governor Cuomo. Mark has also served as a member of the New York State City Council, where he chaired the subcommittees on zoning and franchises of Land Use Committee. Prior to his election to the New York State City Council, Mark served 15 years in the New York State Assembly, where he authored 63 laws and served as chair of the small business community. With such a record, I have no doubt that the room will be completely silent when you speak. Thank you. Mark.
Good evening, everyone. I'll talk really loudly and then, boy, Aaron, I didn't know we were going to get a history lesson and everything. Thank you very much. Talk about the Constitution and what brought us here today. It makes me wonder what George Washington and the Founding Fathers would think of what's going on in the country today, pre-Twitter and all, so it'd be interesting to see. Anyway, thank you very much for being here, PCON. Thank you for inviting me. So, as was mentioned, my name is Mark Weprin. I see a lot of friends here tonight. Those of you who know my name, I come from a political family. As Aaron mentioned, I served for over 20 years as an elected official. I followed my father before me, Saul Weprin, a blessed memory, who was Speaker of the New York State Assembly, and then I ran for his seat. And then I have a brother, David, who many of you know, who currently serves in the New York State Assembly. And has been very active in New York City politics for a long time. So it is a pleasure. I have that history, and my political family is such that we spend most of our childhood talking about politics. A famous story in my family, just quickly, is that my eldest brother's bar mitzvah, the parsha was involving Abraham, and every time the rabbi, when he was discussing it, would mention the word Abraham, I'd yell, who? Abraham Beam? I was 4 years old at the time. Those of you who don't know, so many young people here today, Abraham Beam at the time was, I think, New York City Comptroller, later on the mayor of New York City. But it's a strange family. But it gives me street cred to talk a little about politics and what goes on in the minds of politicians in general. I want to point out before I talk about people, elected officials, that we're joined by my friend from Queens and a very well-respected young elected official, Dan Rosenthal, who's from Kew Garden Hills out in Queens. Give him a round of applause. So this doesn't apply to Dan, but of course, there's an old story that politicians live by two rules, okay? The first rule is to get elected. The second rule is never to forget the first rule. And what I mean by that is getting elected is the ball of wax. How do you get elected? Well, you convince voters to vote for you. And these days, one of the biggest problems we have, I think, in our democracy are primaries, Republican primaries and Democratic primaries. Because why I think that's a problem is the people who tend to vote in Democratic primaries tend to be the most liberal or progressive or now socialist members of that party. And when you have Republican primaries, the people who tend to vote are those who are the most conservative people. Just as an example, you remember when Barack Obama became president, a group called the Tea Party emerged. And Republicans across the country didn't want to do anything that the Tea Party didn't endorse. No matter what your district was, you had to cater to the Tea Party because they're the ones who could take you out of office in a primary. Well, the same is true today in the Democratic Party. Now that Trump is there, a very liberal group has emerged, and the Democratic Socialists have become a real organization. Dan and I are from Queens. We just saw a Democratic Socialist candidate, a proud Democratic Socialist, who would have believed it, almost win the district attorney's seat in Queens. And for two guys who were raising families in Queens, that's a little frightening concept, but that's what's out there today. So why do I bring this up? I was asked to talk a little bit about what happened in Albany, because I know a lot of you are probably thinking that, going to the workshops and saying, are you kidding me? This is what the laws say? But very similar to what I discussed is what's happening currently in New York politics. In New York City politics, for sure. New York City is almost all Democratic elected officials. And none of those Democratic elected officials are generally going to lose a primary from the right. They're going to lose a primary from someone more liberal than them or more to the left of them. So they all live in fear of this organized group. It just so happens we're standing in the one area in the hall of New York City that actually has Republicans here in Staten Island. But generally, they're Democrats, and it's very hard to beat them on the right. I know, and what has happened is the progressives / Democratic Socialists have become very organized, and they were very organized when it came to rent laws. And why are they so organized? Well, first of all, Trump woke up young voters who never voted before. It used to be only old voters voted. Now, young people came out to vote. And the other thing that they do, and I see this in my own household, is they're better at technology than the old people. In my house, whenever something's wrong on the computer, I got to go to my teenage son to fix it, right? Well, the progressives and the socialists were very good at organizing, because through Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all those vehicles, they were able to organize and get a message out that the mainstream Democrats and the conservative Democrats and the Republicans could not do and haven't done yet. And that's how they ended up becoming a force. So going back to the rules, in order to keep their jobs, Democratic legislators, they didn't want to get too far afield from the most progressive element. And that's not true for every district, but most districts had an element that could take them out of office. And they had to play to that. And the problem, like I said, is primaries, that you tend to cater to your base. You hear it all the time in politics. You cater to your base. And in Democratic districts, the base is often these now very left of center Democrats. So that's what happened in Albany, where they were very aggressive, that group. And some of you who worked on it very closely, I know Leon Goldenberg's here, and he worked very hard on this stuff. But they were very aggressive. They said, if you don't support all 9 bills, all 9 pieces of this platform, we're not going to support you for re-election. 8, no good. 7, no good. They were very aggressive. They were very sophisticated, I have to say, in knowing who's saying what. And they were able to communicate with each other in ways they never used to. I mean, the internet is incredible. And that is why they were able to organize. That's why they were able to put pressure on the leaders of both the Senate and the Assembly to not just go after the landlords a little bit, a bissel, go after them a lot. And they did. And unfortunately, the consequences of that, we are going to find out over the next couple of years. The problem is it's not today where they're going to find out. Because I do think they went way too far, and I know you agree with me, because one thing about the New York City housing stock, and it's been praised across the country, is it had been in very good shape. It had been maintained very well. Why? Because there was an incentive for landlords to do repairs beyond the things they had to do, behind the essential heat and hot water. They made buildings look nice, and they kept them. They did brickwork fixing, and they fixed windows, and they put electronic upgrades, so they can organize on Twitter and beat us. I mean, that's a big part of what makes buildings worthwhile. And now there's no incentive to do that, and we are going to see the effects of that. So what is the answer? I won't go on too long here, but what do you need to do to organize? See, it's not just giving money to campaigns, and it's not just talking to your local. You have to figure out how to inspire voters, because believe it or not, even with my cynical comments about how they feel about getting elected, the system works where voters have the ability to move legislators. You know, people think that the president or the governor, they make the policies. Really, it's the people who make the policies. It's the people who pressure those people, or they feel, where do I make changes to get things done? It's funny, my grandfather came here. One of his cousins died in 1911 at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, one of his cousins. That fire, where about 145 people died, mostly young women, many of them Jews, changed laws throughout this country because of what happened there. And it was an organized movement, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and elected officials who saw the pressure they were getting locally, and that's what changed laws. The civil rights laws were changed not by the elected officials who were sitting there, the people who were pressuring those elected officials. So if you think you're going to make changes, the way to do that is to get organized and to figure out, how do we message the right messages? And get your kids to teach the internet better, you know, at least in my case. I'm sure a lot of you are better than I am. But also, how do you win this fight? When you're a landlord, with all due respect, nobody likes landlords. Everyone has a landlord. No matter how small a landlord you are, you're still the landlord. And it's hard to be a public official. And believe me, I know not being liked. Remember, I'm a lawyer. I'm an elected official. All these things everyone hates, so don't worry about it. I'm not insulting anyone here. But how do you get people to support you is to make the message not only about the landlords, but about all the jobs that are being lost. How many electricians and plumbers and maintenance workers are going to lose jobs because of this? And then, how many affordable units will not be built, not be repaired? How many people are going to live in a terrible apartment just because the rent is cheap, and they could have had such a nicer apartment either here, and they're not going to be able to get out because they can't afford to go anywhere else? So it's important we try to work on messaging, you know, and that's important. So Aaron was nice. You know, I currently work in a law firm. I left government. I had 2 kids in college. I had to pay for that. We do you know, a lot of government affairs work, so I work with the elected officials very often. And I'm telling you, even those who we spoke to, and a lot of us lobbied up in Albany, in their hearts they may have agreed with us, but in their political heads, they couldn't afford to lose the support of the right. And, you know, and that was true for all the leaders and all the individual members who were from areas where there was pockets of support. So I don't give a happy message necessarily, but it's an accurate message that the only way to swing elected officials, it's not to be nice. It's not like a judge. You know, you go to a judge or you go to an arbiter, they look at the facts. Yeah, this guy had this hurt, this guy is that. Let's come to a compromise, or you make a good point. You make a good point, you're the landlord, that's a good point, but I got 150 tenants who have the other point. So guess what? You lose. All right? I don't care about the merits. I care about my votes. I got 150 votes here. I got one landlord who may not even live in my district, and that's the equation. And that's what happened up there in Albany. Now, it was worse this year than ever before and more than we imagined, and it's because the left got as organized as they were. What I described before, they were much more aggressive than we ever would have imagined, and they were better at it, to be frank, than the people who were moderate Democrats or pro-landlord. And they were just better at it this time. And so my message to all of you is to get better at it, is to figure out, how do you tap into the psyche of constituents, of legislators who then are going to follow them, if that makes any sense. So with that happy message in mind, I do thank you for having me here today. I think this conference is very important to educate people about what the changes were, but more importantly, how to fight it, how to make your voices heard, because they weren't heard beyond you guys talking. You need to spread that message. And unfortunately, things are going to change out there, if not for the better, and the message will resonate more, but it's going to take some time. So you start organizing now, and I know there are people in this room doing that, in order to get your message out. And that's the important part. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for taking up your time. And enjoy the rest of your meal, and good luck in the future. Thank you.